That means we're started. Oh, there we go. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today on Mindful Family. I'm really looking forward to it. My name is Mark Bertin. I'm a developmental pediatrician from the New York area and author of a couple of books that integrate mindfulness into the rest of pediatric care. And I'm here with Chris Willard, who I'll let introduce himself in a moment, and Susan Kaiser, Greenland. And honestly, I'm looking forward to see what I can learn from them today too. So what we're going to do today is we're each going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes to start. I'm going to talk about mindfulness for parents. Chris is going to talk about self-compassion for families. Susan's going to talk about mindfulness in children, and then open it up to a Q&A. So we'll each talk for just a few minutes, and then we'll jump in. And I think I'll jump in and start with what I wanted to go over about mindfulness in parents first, and then I'll end with a little bit of a short practice and then hand it over to Chris. So thank you all for being here, and welcome everyone who's watching the recording, which will go up sometime in the next couple of days. So there's so much being said about mindfulness nowadays. I think it's important to start just by defining it, and I'll give my little bit of perspective on it. Really, when it comes to talking about mindfulness in families, I think it's important to start with talking about its value for parents for many reasons, not the least of which is the only thing we ever control in any particular situation are the choices we make individually. So that one of the most powerful ways to bring mindfulness to any family as a parent is simply to practice it yourself. And I'm sure Chris and Susan will talk about how you might introduce it to children and the challenges of introducing it to children. But sometimes the concept with kids is referred to as planting seeds of mindfulness. So we're trying to get them interested and involved over time. But we can always trust that if we practice it ourselves, it's going to have a big impact on our families. So the textbook definition of mindfulness is often something along the lines of moment-to-moment unbiased, or giving moment-to-moment unbiased awareness to our experience. Those are just words, though, and I think it's important to try to find a meaning behind them. And I actually would like to start with really one other broader concept I find increasingly important in kind of our crazy, intense world we're living in right now, which is one of the aspects of the teaching that always connected to me from the beginning is there's a concept of catching yourself and looking at whatever you're hearing, whatever you're believing, and asking yourself, is it true? Is this something that really resonates and is real? Because there's nothing any of the three of us can say today that's really going to matter to your life unless you connect with it, you think it's valuable and real, and then you practice it. So the reason the concept of moment-to-moment unbiased awareness is so important for families and parents is that parenting in general, not just in this moment of crisis, but in general, is just full of uncertainty and challenges and things we can't control. And day to day, if we don't put effort into it, we tend to get caught up in reactivity. Our mind is being launched into a future of anxiety, caught up in past anxieties, caught up in problems. And without practice, that state of sort of autopilot and reactivity can be all-consuming. So the reason in mindfulness we aim to practice this concept of sort of giving life more moment-to-moment awareness isn't for any cliched reason. It's because that's what allows us to navigate whatever we're living through more skillfully. And there's nothing more important right now than recognizing that we're all off balance and we're all wound up in different ways. And as parents, we can't deny that, but we can work on things that help us relate to it with more skill. So when you look at that concept, you sort of break down that definition into, what does it mean to be moment-to-moment aware? What is the unbiased part? And what is the awareness part? Each of them has practical value to explore. So it's always important to me when I'm talking about mindfulness, I always tell people, call me on it if you feel like you're hearing a mindfulness cliche, because the cliches get used and overused, and mindfulness is packaged all sorts of different ways. But it's meant to be realistic and it's meant to be useful. So the moment-to-moment part of it is just that recognition that our minds continue to go all over the place all the time. And that has really profound implications. So if you think about it as a parent, if you look at any major behavioral program, one of the aspects of that behavioral program, like we're trying to support children, is simply giving positive attention to our kids. And if you think of the average, really chaotic, busy day, what happens? It's so easy to just get caught up in trying to get things done and our work and fear about, the election next week and everything else going on. And meanwhile, life is still happening. And, how often as parents do we hear that sort of phrase like, Dad, you're not paying attention to me. Dad, you're not listening. So there's a lot about attention and connection that really starts with just giving full attention to the people around us, to our experience. It directly relates to the concept of resilience in the middle of this crisis, because in the middle of the crisis, in the middle of everything going on, our resilience is going to, in part, rely on those moments that are restorative, those moments that are positive, those little moments of engagement, enjoying our morning coffee. Not the world may be in crisis, but moment to moment, there may be something we are experiencing that does give us back something, that does help us stay strong. And the other thing that's really important about this idea of aiming to give life more moment to moment awareness in that way is that that's where choice begins. So it's so easy when we're caught up in reactivity and stress and fear to just fall back on the same habits we've always fallen back on. So we have exactly the same argument we've always had over homework, because once we're triggered, we say the same things, and then our child says the same things, and it goes back and forth, and maybe it escalates. So if we're going to think flexibly and problem solve, and I think, by the way, in case it isn't apparent, this certainly goes for anyone in a family, but I think it goes for us society-wide as well. If we're going to break these cycles of just doing the same old thing and reactivity and fear, one of the ways to look at mindfulness is it's never meant to be passive. It's meant to be precise. It's not that we're okay with everything. It's that we're going to try to navigate it as well as we can. And that could be a challenge at home where we catch ourselves long enough to settle a little bit. Then the next part of mindfulness, the unbiased awareness part, is just seeing things with clarity, trying to see things exactly, as they are, clearly as we can, because that's what's going to let us navigate them more easily. And that goes both at home and everywhere else in life too. So if we want to support our children, it's really helpful that in the middle of a challenge, we take the time to, there was a book recently on the science of mindfulness called Altered Traits. So we take the time to build the traits that we find help us handle the fact that, the world seems like it's falling apart quite often lately, perhaps. And in any moment, we should, on the one hand, be looking for ways we can influence that for the better, do things that seem proactive and are useful. And on the other hand, try that as best as we're able to stay settled in a way that supports our children. So the research says, in essence, that it's part of how I started teaching this as a physician. As I was practicing, I guess I'll pause for a second there and just say, I was practicing this on my own for many years before I decided to start integrating it into my medical practice, for better or worse, but that's what I was doing at the time. And then what happened was the research just started taking off exponentially. So for any of you who are listening who aren't all that familiar with mindfulness, it really is becoming evidence-based practice. So now we have lots of research saying that mindfulness helps with the management of stress, the management of anxiety. There's related research that says that one of the predictors, I say this with a little hesitation because I want to explain it. I don't want any parents to blame themselves for their child's stress in any way, but there is research that correlates a parent's stress level with their child's stress level. So we need to be realistic as parents. We don't want to hide things from parents. It doesn't mean your stress is causing your child's stress. But instead, I think it just honors the fact and reflects the fact that if we can do the things as a parent that help us take care of ourselves, that influences everything else in our household. One of the best pieces of advice I got going into medical school was simply, as busy and crazy as things get, find one thing that just helps keep you sane and grounded, and then just don't let it go. And I think in this moment of crisis, a lot of the things that help us sustain our resilience are kind of old school. It's kind of one of the things you discover as you practice mindfulness is quite often, we don't need more information. It's not that we need more facts. In fact, we might need more true facts. There's a lot of, misinformation going around. But in terms of knowing what it is that's going to sustain us as individuals, sustain our families, the facts are kind of straightforward quite often. We can look at practicing mindfulness, but it has value. We can look at the fact that, sleep and exercise help keep us, I think it's sometimes underemphasized that our physical health influences our emotional health that way. Staying connected with people. All of these things are going to help support us, support our families. And the real challenge isn't knowing that. The real challenge is doing the things that help us sustain those simple practices or those simple concepts. So I think in looking at what mindfulness means for parents and families, it's a very open-ended question, and just sort of pull it together so I leave time for Chris and Susan, and I want to lead a little practice. I would say that your family's resilience in many ways starts with you. And a mindfulness practice doesn't mean that every time you sit and meditate or something, you're going to be relaxed and peaceful, but it sets a tone, and really the intention is looking at how we're relating to day-to-day life. It's not about whether you meditate or not. It's a looking at, can we, that same concept of, can we relate to our experience as it's happening as skillfully as we're able, as I'm sure Chris will touch on, without a sense of perfectionism and harshness, because we can't do that all the time. It's more about setting an intention. I heard a great quote on that recently, which is just that, there's lots of wisdom in this practice of mindfulness. There's many different topics we can talk about, but no one can do it perfectly. And yet at the same time, how many people are setting the intention of living that way? Even if it's imperfect, just trying to live life as skillfully as we're able, to relate to our experience and people as skillfully as we're able, is a pretty profound thing to try to do. So I think I'll pause there. But what I will do is I just want to explain, because mindfulness and meditation are related but not exactly the same terms, I just want to introduce mindfulness meditation real quick, and then lead maybe a minute practice or two, and then hand it over to Chris. So in the context of mindfulness, there's a style of meditation that really has to do with not going somewhere else, but coming back to our reality. So we're often focusing on something concrete that's here, meaning literally here, like when we breathe, there's a physical movement in our body. There's a practice where you can focus on the physical sensation of the feet on the floor. I know Chris and I both lead a practice for kids quite often where you focus on sounds in the environment. And you're not trying to force anything to happen. You're not trying to feel any particular way. It's just something literal that you can anchor your awareness with. So your mind goes off somewhere else, and then you come back again. And then it happens again, and you come back again. And over time, that has layers of meaning. There's all sorts of things you can explore through that simple practice. But the core concept initially is simply you catch yourself when your mind wanders, and you come back again with patience, with compassion. So I think I'll stop there, and I'd like to lead just a little bit of a practice and then hand it over to Chris. So thank you all for your awareness and attention there. And what I'd like you all to do for just a moment as we transition is find yourself a comfortable posture wherever you are. And then either lower your gaze or shut your eyes. And you might even take a moment to check in with how things are right now for you. Notice the state of your mind, where your thoughts are. Notice your emotional state. Notice if there's anything particularly strong that you're feeling in your body right now. And then as best as you're able, bring your awareness to the fact that there is a physical sensation to each breath that you take. And you might even label it mentally, breathing in and breathing out. And your mind will likely stay busy. You may stay up in thoughts, or immediately experience thoughts like this is great or this is terrible. And just noticing those as thoughts come back again to the next breath. For a few moments, there's nothing to do, nothing to fix, nowhere to go. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes. Bring your awareness back to our virtual talk today, our virtual classroom. So thank you all for your attention on that. And I'll hand it over to Chris now. See what Chris has to say.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I just want to say it's so fun to be here. A couple of my absolute favorite people in the mindfulness world to be presenting with. And I don't think the three of us have ever presented together. So here we all are, and it's a little reunion for the three of us. And thank everyone for joining us. And thank you, Haskins, for hosting us. So my name is Chris Willard. I'm a number of things. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, author, mindfulness educator, also a father of two kids. And so facing this pandemic stress along with the rest of us. And I wanted to talk a little bit about mindfulness and self-compassion for us as parents, and to build also a little bit on what Mark had been sharing about, I guess, about the way that it's important to start with ourselves. I often in my talks, there's this meme I saw online once that says, never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. And, you know, it's funny, when I was a teacher, I noticed this. As a therapist, I've noticed this. As a parent, right? What we want to do in mindfulness is not just calming down, right? But when we're dysregulated by the pandemic, by the stress of the world, by everything that's going on, our kids are also dysregulated. These things work in tandem. When they're dysregulated, we often get dysregulated, which is a fancy sounding clinical term for, losing our minds, basically. What we can do, though, is we can do this thing called co-regulation. That's what actually helps us to settle down, helps our kids to settle down. And we really set the tone as parents, as educators, right? Whatever your role is with kids, it really starts with us and trickles down. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was reading this great piece in The Atlantic by Lori Gottlieb, and someone had written in, how do we talk to our kids about the pandemic? She's a wonderful writer and psychotherapist. And she said, and I'll use a few actually airplane examples. She said, imagine you're on an airplane, and hopefully none of us have been on airplanes recently, right? And, it gets a little bit bumpy and everyone kind of looks around nervously, right? And then the captain gets on and, ding, ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence, right? And everyone just kind of settles down, right? Just by naming it, it's turbulence. Okay, good. The engine didn't fall off, right? And then the pilot says something like, we're going to change course. We're going to get you to your destination safely. We might be a few minutes late to the gate. Please stay in your seat. Don't move around the cabin until we take off this fashion seatbelt sign. And I think that's such a great metaphor for the situation that we're in. We're in this airplane. We've hit turbulence. We're going to get to the gate. We don't know when. But what happens when the captain gets on the loudspeaker, right, is she or he then sets the tone and everyone's able to calm down. And that's what we're doing as parents. Right. The other kind of classic airplane cliche, of course, is right. The oxygen masks drop down, put your own mask on before you put on the one for your child. That's going to be so important to us getting through this tough time. And even if the engine fell off and the captain's anxious, I don't want to know that the captain is anxious, because that's going to make everyone on the plane panic. And this is a really tricky thing as parents. All of our emotions, but particularly anxiety, is actually really quite contagious. And so while we're often in our generation told, right, talk about feelings with kids, one of the ones we want to be a little bit more cautious about is anxiety, is stress, because that will start to spread to our kids. So we want to find ways to take good care of ourselves And then that will actually start to ripple out with our kids. And the research finds this to be true. Parents who practice mindfulness and self-compassion, they're more patient with the kids, they're happier. Family communication and things like that go up even when the kids don't necessarily practice, right? In a couple, when one person's practicing mindfulness, the other person in the couple and the partnership, right, is actually happier those days and weeks that they're practicing. When one person's practicing self-compassion, that actually impacts the people around us. So these practices really are contagious. And so I do think it's really important to find ways to start with ourselves, to be more resilient ourselves as parents through this really hard time, to navigate through to the other side. Even if we're a little bit nervous, right? The more we can manage ourselves, the more safe and secure our children are going to feel. And then the more likely they're going to come out the other side of this more resilient. I've gotten really interested recently in post-traumatic growth and resilience. And there's these factors, right, that really create that a lot more in both kids and adults. One of the biggest factors for kids is, right, a stable adult in their life, right? Safe and secure. So that becomes really important. Mark also touched on this idea of, right, resilience is caring for ourselves in many ways. And I've been thinking about how can I apply mindfulness in my life and share mindfulness with other people during this time around these three variables of what we say in my profession as a biopsychosocial model, or as Mark said in a little bit more, normal everyday language, right? Are we caring for our bodies? Are we doing that with mindfulness, with mindful movement and exercise, which are wonderful things for a family to do together, whether it's a formal practice or whether it's all the time so many of us are spending in nature these days, right? Mindfully bring more awareness to eating, right? Things like this, right? We can mindfully care for our minds, the psychological, and practices like Mark just offered. And we can also bring more mindful awareness to our relationships, the relationships we have with our kids, the relationships that we're, the interactions that we're having online and off, right? Mostly online, which is not always the happiest place to be interacting with people, doesn't usually bring out the best in everybody, right? And bring more compassion to all of these, right? And then also bringing more compassion to ourselves. And so, to respond to a few of the questions that are out there, right? One of the things we want to do, and I think Susan will talk about this also, but are find practices that actually do work for us and our families. And they don't have to be sitting still for 20 minutes. We can find these shorter practices or these moments in our day where we build in a ritual, and ritual is one of the most important things we can do to build resilience, right? Everyone's life has fallen apart. March 13th, Friday the 13th, everything went haywire. As a parent, I remember people posting, school is canceled. Here's your homeschool schedule, right? At 9 o'clock, you'll make breakfast with the kids and do math. And at 9:30, you'll all read together. And at 10 o'clock, everyone can learn, do PE and do yoga together. And 2 days after that, right, everyone's posting memes that are like, everyone wake up at 10, 10 to noon, Minecraft time, and noon to 1, everyone eat potato chips for lunch, and, 1 to 5, everyone fall asleep on the couch. We can find something in between these by creating rituals, right? Routines, rather than this time, right? First this, then that. It makes life predictable. Post-traumatic stress develops when we feel this life is unpredictable and we feel helpless. The situation, and we can't predict the next 6 months or 6 weeks or what's going to happen 6 days from now, but we can ourselves and our families help predict these next 6 hours and create a space in which we feel safer, right? To do some gratitude before bed, to do a little mindful moment before dinner, even if it's 30 seconds or a minute. And for ourselves to come back to this, to set the tone of finding some compassion for ourselves. So self-compassion practices, which I know Mark is doing a lot of writing about, and coming out of the work of folks like Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, who I certainly encourage you to check out. Self-compassion is really finding a way to treat ourselves with the kindness and patience that we might, right, treat someone that we particularly care about, right, like a child. right? Often we don't treat ourselves with the kindness that we treat others. So the elements, as Chris and Kristen define them, are a mindful awareness and naming of our experience, to just be aware of it. And then a way of connecting this to our own common humanity, that we're all struggling and suffering. And then lastly, offering ourselves some kind words or some kindness to quiet down that critical voice that really all of us have, saying, you're not doing a good enough job, right? You don't have your act together. Those other families, they're doing this pandemic great. Your family's a disaster. So learning how to turn the volume down on that critical voice and turn the volume up on what we might think of as a more compassionate voice. So we can even try this together. I'll just lead us through a little exercise, actually adapted from Chris and Kristen, called the self-compassion break. And if you've got 3 minutes, you can try this. You can find downloads. You can rewatch this recording. I'll just invite you, just find a comfortable posture, just sitting up. As Mark said, you can allow your eyes to close or your gaze just to fall on the floor or keyboard in front of you. I'll ring the bell. And I'll invite you to bring to mind a difficult moment. But I'm going to ask that be a small, difficult moment, mistake, imperfection. You were running late, getting the kids out the door. Maybe like me, you lost your patience when your daughter refused to put her pants on before preschool. Maybe dinner was late getting on the table, or maybe you overindulged yourself and too much ice cream after the kids went to bed. Just a little moment where maybe that critical voice started to act up. And as you bring the scene to mind, you might notice what it feels like in your body as you hear that inner critic start its chatter, that comparison to all the other parents. And I'll invite you now just to name what's happening. This is unpleasant. I don't like this. This sucks. Shut up. Just name this experience. This is a tough moment. I don't like this. And then I'll invite you to maybe make some kind of gesture as you would a friend, even your own kid. You might give them a hug. If you don't feel too still, you can give yourself a hug or put a hand on your shoulder or over your heart. Feel that gentle warmth. And becoming aware of that connection, the common humanity. Words that feel authentic to you, or a tone like, this is hard for all of us. None of us is doing this pandemic thing perfectly. This is a fresh challenge for everybody. Nobody is perfect. We're all muddling through. Everyone in this call is feeling imperfect. Even our esteemed teachers up here facilitating, we're all feeling like we're not doing enough. Offering yourself those words, or words of that sentiment that feel authentic to you. And then lastly, just finding some last few words of kindness for yourself. Mistakes happen. I can learn from this. I can grow from this. We can get through this. Whatever feels right to you. Taking a moment to just offer that. And then lastly, offering words or a sentiment like that to all of us here today, muddling through. And I'll just ring the bell once more. And you can bring your awareness back outward. Maybe even first looking away from the screen that we're sick of looking at all the time before you bring your eyes back. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Susan.
All right. Thanks for that, Chris. I think I'll just mention in the transition, because it comes up so commonly, maybe we'll come back to it in the Q&A, that the research around self-compassion shows that if we let go of the perfectionism and self-criticism, even though a lot of people feel like that's what drives them to improvement, it actually tends to improve our overall motivation and persistence and well-being. So thank you for sharing that. And Susan, I'm looking forward to hearing and learning from you.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be here. So thank you. And both Mark and Chris, I feel much more grounded than I did getting on the call. So thank you for that time. Thank you to Haskins for hosting this. As Chris said, Chris and I have been pals for a very, very long time, but it's hard to find the time to carve out to connect. So this has been a gift, just a real gift to be able to connect and to teach with Mark, who I've never taught with before. And he and I too have been pals for a long time. So thank you for all of that. And I did have a chance to scroll through these comments, and it seems as if there has been a little bit of a problem, a technical problem. But I just wanted to apologize for that technical problem to the extent that there was one, and remind people that it looks like it's been solved, but if you missed the beginning, this will be posted online. So you'll be able to catch the first part of the program if you missed the beginning. So thank you for being here, and I apologize for the almost predictable now technical problems with all of these different Zoom calls that we're all on. So I think Mark mentioned that I was going to talk about mindfulness in kids and mindfulness in families. And I want to build a little bit on a couple of the things that Mark and Chris spoke about, and then go from there. The first is that Mark was talking about this notion that is often talked about is it true? Is it true? And that's, a very important inquiry for all of us. And one of my favorite add-ons to that inquiry comes from one of my favorite teachers. His name is Soni Rinpoche, and he's from the Tibetan tradition, and you can find him online. And he has a mantra. He tends to give his students a mantra most years. And a few years back, his mantra was, "It may feel real, but is it true?" Or "It may feel real, but it's not true." And that's a real helpful thing to remember as parents, and also to tell older kids that, these things that seem so true, that seem so solid and absolute, and of course it's true, sure feel that way. So they feel real, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're true. And so that helps soften up the mind around these feelings. And it also is a wonderful way of acknowledging that it does feel true. So by using the distinction between the word real and true, it does feel like it's real. So we acknowledge that feeling, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And so that's a very, very important one. And how that shows up in family life all the time is it does feel right now, for instance, that we are going to be on Zoom forever. Zoom meetings will never end. That's how it feels, but it's not necessarily true. Or it really does feel like I'm never going to be able to see my friends in person again without a mask. And that is how it feels. So it feels real, but it's not necessarily true. So being able to acknowledge the feeling, and then there's just kind of a sigh that happens, right? Or at least that happens with me. You acknowledge the feeling that it's, whew, okay, so I'm not crazy. This does feel real. But then you can start thinking about whether or not it's true. Then I want to talk a little bit more and expand a little bit more on what Chris was talking about with respect to what I talk about as nervous system, because honestly, the mindfulness piece is so very, very important. But unless we have it coupled with an understanding of how our nervous systems work and how our kids' nervous systems work, we're very limited in how far we can go with it. So let me do just a really quick nervous system primer that hopefully will be helpful. So if you think about when our nervous systems get worked up, when we get upregulated, this seems like an awful thing, right? Sometimes when we're kind of losing it, but it's actually a very healthy response. It's good that our nervous systems are getting worked up because we sense that there's something dangerous going on. We sense that there's some sort of threat. And so as a result, our energy really moves away from the problem-solving part of our brain and more into the reactive mode. It's if you have your hand in a fire, you don't want to think, should I pull it out? Should I keep it there? You want to just react. The effect of our energy moving away from problem solving to more reacting to danger is that our bandwidth, which is generally up here, around here, narrows. It narrows quite significantly so that our focus gets smaller. Our capacity to think, to listen, to learn, to be open to new ideas is smaller because that energy for that critical thinking, for that problem solving, has been diverted toward something that we think is for survival. This is terrific when we're getting chased in the woods by a bear, or when we're rushing out of the house because you're being evacuated because there's a fire in the backyard, which happens to us now in California more and more. You get the evacuation order, and so you want to just be able to rush. I will tell you personally, having had that happen, it's very tough in that moment to think, now, what do I really want to bring in case my house burns down? Because that problem solving has really narrowed. You just are in saving yourself mode. So it's a very healthy thing, and we don't want to beat ourselves up for this survival mechanism we have. But when we understand it, then we can do something about it. And one of the beauties and one of the magical qualities really of mindfulness is there are mindfulness-based approaches that help us go from this more narrow bandwidth to be more grounded and broaden our bandwidth. And when our bandwidth is broader, then we are open and we're receptive and able to listen and learn. So think about how this affects you, and think about how this affects your kids. For you, you can certainly see it. You're getting worked up for some reason. Your bandwidth narrows, and all of a sudden you're not thinking that clearly, perhaps. Instead, you're just snapping or being more reactive. Happens to everybody. We don't beat ourselves up for it. But what we can do is we can take a moment and do one of the practices that that Mark and that Chris just did, and just settle ourselves, ground ourselves in the present moment. Pay a little more attention to the exhale. And with that, we tend to ground ourselves and get a little bit more headspace to be able to think through the problems. But and we need to do that first so we understand it ourselves, and so that we don't do what Chris was talking about, is be the kind of super spreader of anxiety. We're talking about all these super spreading events right now. Well, if we're all worked up, we can be the super spreader of anxiety. So we need to first notice, okay, I'm worked up. My bandwidth is like this. I got to take a moment and settle myself, lower my shoulders, feel my feet against the ground. But it's equally important that we see that when we are engaging with our kids and, frankly, with our spouses. My kids are almost 30 now. I'm in a 30-year marriage with my husband. I can tell you those early years would have been a whole lot easier if I had a clue about the nervous system, because the number of times their bandwidth was like this, they didn't have the capacity to be able to be open, receptive, and ready to learn. And I still got in there and tried to problem solve, and I still got in there and tried to sort out the problem. If I had just noticed that they were worked up, noticed the effect of that, you can often see it because there's often tension in the body, and in response had settled myself, helped with the co-regulation that Chris was talking about, then we could have both settled down together, and then coming back later to talk through whatever the problem is that got us all worked up in the first place. So that's the first piece of this nervous system that I think understanding their nervous system primer that I think is really key for every teacher, for every parent, for anybody who works with kids to understand with themselves and with others. And how there are mindfulness-based approaches that help you once you are aware that you're worked up, that help you kind of turn the tables on that, and you learn to ground and settle yourselves so that your bandwidth opens more. The other piece that's equally important with these kind of ideas is that our capacity, regardless of age, let's just say it's right here, and this is our capacity to handle incoming stress. But what happens when our incoming stress, the amount of stress meets our capacity to handle, this is the sweet spot. This is where we are at our best. And this is also where resilience is built, because we are able to handle the incoming stress in a way that is open, receptive, ready to learn, right? Because we need some stimulation. If we don't have any stimulation, we're just like this. We need some healthy stimulation. I've got some going now because I'm talking to you, right? So that's going to bring me up here. When that stimulation meets my capacity, then this is the sweet spot. When that stimulation goes up here and it's over the capacity, then what we tend to do is we tend to fall over onto one or the other side of a curve, which is either we fight or flight, which we're all very familiar with, or freeze, which I now, having learned from Chris, this last two words to add on to that many years ago, or forget it, which we see a lot of with teenagers. And I think Chris in that presentation said sometimes there's another F word that he uses to describe this freeze, forget it, or something else with teenagers. So what if you've got a teenager or an older child who's doing this, right? I wouldn't be, or if you're a teacher, I wouldn't be surprised if your first response was, wow, that guy is defiant. I think he's defiant. And then what does that do to us? It makes us want to push back. What if we reframe that a little bit? And what if we just sit back and think, he's a little too much for him. He's a little bit overwhelmed. He's not being defiant. He's just overwhelmed. When we reframe in that way, all of a sudden something shifts and compassion has the opportunity to emerge naturally. We're no longer taking this personally. We no longer think it's about us. We recognize the truth of the situation, which is it's about them. They're feeling overwhelmed. What can we do to help? So those are just a couple of ideas about how to work with yourselves and with children of all ages when you see this nervous system getting a little bit on overdrive, when we see a lot of emotional charge. And certainly in times of the pandemic and Zoom school, we've seen a lot of that. So I want to keep an eye on the time, and I know that everybody wanted us to give practices. So one of the things that happens, I give a very fast practice. And again, this is a practice that I learned from Sony Rinpoche, and his brother Mingyur Rinpoche does one that's similar to fabulous Tibetan teachers. And this is a way, many of us, when we start to get worked up, when we start to get upregulated, we feel a lot of speedy energy or very nervous energy. And it's important to give kids ways to release that nervous energy in a way that doesn't escalate it. I'm sure all of you have seen, especially young kids, running around the playground and running more. And what happens? The stress escalates. But it is a good way to release nervous energy, but you're just building it. If you toggle between movement and stillness, that is a way to release the speedy energy and to help ground yourself. It also builds resilience. If you want to take a look at Peter Levine's book, Trauma Proofing Your Kids, that is laid out in more detail in that fantastic book. So really quickly, right here, let's see how we could just do this sitting at desks. Everybody just raise your arms like this. And then just on the count of three, I just want you to shake. Just shake. Keep your shoulders loose. Keep your jaw shake. Then 1, 2, 3, drop. Then just feel your breathing, your feet on the floor, your sits bones, that's with a Z, your sits bones on your seat. And then we're raising our hands again, and we're shaking again. Keep your jaw loose, just shake it out. 1, 2, 3, drop. Lower your shoulders. feel your breathing one last time. Raise your arms and just shake. Shake the sillies out. If you're a little kid, if you're an older kid, you shake out that speedy energy. And 1, 2, 3, drop. I am somebody who has a lot of experience with speedy energy. So this particular practice has been a lifesaver for me. But that toggling between movement and stillness does reverse this escalating contagious cycle. And it's a way to skillfully release that speedy energy and then feel settled. So thank you, everybody. And I'll pass it back to Mark.
I'm going to go off script here for a second. So I think there's a lot of interest in how to teach to kids. So I'm wondering if we can just, in almost like a speed round, do like a minute or two on maybe I'll give my take on a quick overview. Maybe I'll put you on the spot, Chris, if you want to talk about teaching teens, just a minute or two of how to frame it. Mm-hmm. And then Susan, because I often talk about making these things developmentally appropriate, has written a lot about mindful games. So I think it's a good transition maybe about younger kids. So for anyone because I saw a couple of questions about this, generally speaking, the way I often think about teaching mindfulness to kids is a very top-down approach of, first of all, mindfulness starts with us as families, in families with us as parents in general. So in some situations, it may be that no one else in the family wants to practice initially, and that's fine. Just trust the fact that your own practice makes a big difference. And then if you're going to want to teach it or discuss it or introduce it to anyone else in your family, that has to come out of your own knowledge and experience. So, translating it to anybody else means you have to understand it a little bit. And then I think in general, you can look at it. I'm not sure if I've seen a question about teens, but when you look at it through, my lens, I'm in the field of child development, making it real for teens. Often the practices themselves don't have to be changed all that much, but you have to frame it in a way that connects for them, or maybe introduce it to them in a peer group because that's where they are in their stage of development. So for anyone interested in working with teens, it involves a little bit of understanding what a parent's relationship with their teen is like, and really trying to connect with the overall practice in a way that's developmentally appropriate, but doesn't necessarily have to change the practice all that much. And then as kids get younger, again, it has to be what's developmentally appropriate from our elementary, middle school age children. And that's where I'm going to just touch on it briefly and let Chris and Susan talk. But just recognizing that maybe some of the concepts need to be explained a little differently. The practices have to be made, presented in a way that, maybe shortens them, maybe talks about them a little differently. And then as children get younger and younger, so much of their lives are about play that you have to describe it again in a way that's developmentally makes sense. So maybe very simple or minimal explanations. And the activities often become, not that you can't lead a breathing practice for a very young child, but you might tie it to an activity like put a stuffed animal on your belly and then see if you can rock the animal to sleep, because that's what's going to connect for a really young child. So I think as an overview of a very big question that comes up, that's how I generally think about, what's different for age appropriateness in terms of making it connect for different ages. So I don't know if Chris, if you have a line or two you want to say about teens, and then we'll move on to Susan.
Yeah, I think you really just want to meet kids where they are. And I'm always aware when I'm speaking to a group of parents that teens often don't want to hear from their parents. And so, what I recommend is, see if the therapist, has an interest in mindfulness, see if the soccer coach, might be the person to start to share this, or the youth group leader at your church or synagogue, right? Or a camp counselor or someone like that, because whatever it is, right, our kids, and it won't last forever, but when they're teenagers, they go through that time where they don't really want to learn much from us because they know everything and everyone else knows something and we know nothing. So if you feel like this is hard to introduce to your teenager, it is. I just want to make that clear. And then I think finding a way to tie it to an interest of theirs, or make it relevant to them, So, I meet with so many kids as a therapist, and a lot of kids are actually interested in being therapists. So, here, this breath practice is a way to stop, a panic attack from happening. It's psychological first aid. You can share this with a friend. Oh, that's cool. right? Or I was working with a friend this morning on, helping him create some stuff for athletes. And he's, and there's so many sports teams, right, that have mental fitness coaches. Our friend Amy Saltzman's written about that, and Gina Beagle, right? These are, different ways to introduce mindfulness or into creativity in the arts, or even just for teens who love, so many teens love music as a coping skill, right? I'll suggest listen to your favorite song mindfully. Notice the emotions at different points in the song. Where can you feel them in your body? Try listening to just one instrument. Just listen to the guitar sample for the whole 4 or 5 minutes. If your mind wanders off, bring it back to the guitar. That's 4 or 5 minutes of focused attention. That's more interesting than saying, focus on your breath for 5 minutes, right? So we can find things that are mindfulness or mindfulness adjacent that might particularly resonate for those kids when they're teenagers. And then learning from their friends, I think, is also really important. And that's where, these wonderful teen retreat programs like IB.me and folks like that are doing a great job of having kids teach kids, or young people teach kids. And it's so important that kids have teachers that they look up to and trust. And of course, they look up to and trust us as parents, but they might not be interested in hearing from us right now. So
thanks, Chris. And Susan, do you want to continue that into younger children?
Sure. And I'm taking a quick look at the chat box, and so I'll try to integrate a little bit of these questions. I mean, first, when Kinder is in the house, a dear friend of ours. She has a great program, Wellness Works for Kids, and she reminds us that the shaking is good, but also anything that is like opposites, big to small, loud to quiet, fast to slow. All of those things are so easy to do, especially when you're talking about younger kids. So when you talk about younger kids, we can speak really, really loudly and shout, and then we can get very, very quiet. Or we can sing very loudly, or we can get very, very quiet. Or with our hands, we can go big and small, big and small. And those are really good for the young kids. And they are ways of releasing that energy and also building resilience. So thank you, Wynn, for that reminder. Someone was asking for the names of the Tibetan teachers. They are 2 brothers from a fabulous family. It's Tsoknyi Rinpoche, Tsokyi, and Mingyur Rinpoche, Mingur. You can find them easily online. And then it's Rinpoche after that. And then someone's asking to share as much as we can about the very youngest children, 1 and 2-year-olds. One of the things I'd suggest you do with really little toddlers are things that really involve synchronizing what you are doing with them. So you can sit back to back, and you can, weave your elbows together, and then you can see if you can breathe in sync, breathing in sync like that. Or if you like, with a child, you can do some breaths. Actually, Chris has got a great book out. It's Alpha Breaths with a bunch of breaths that are fun breaths that are ways to breathe. And if you just look at that book and see some of them, then you can do them together. And where you can do them together, where you're actually feeling there's a visceral connection, either back to back or side to side or front to front, that really helps with the little kids as far as regulating and co-regulating. As the kids get a little bit older, you can start adding in some songs and some movements and some rhymes and that sort of thing. And remember, there are a ton of children's books out there, many children's books that are not mindfulness based, that are classical books that teach concepts of mindfulness. Even Otis the Truck is a very well-known, best-selling book now. His original book, the very last page, he is sitting quietly under the tree, feeling his breath and settling. So that's another great way, using picture books, and they don't always have to be mindfulness. One thing to remember on the mindfulness front is we really don't want to say mindfulness all the time. It's a great way to turn people off. Yes. So like what we do with any kind of good teaching is we describe what we want to do. Let's just stop right now at the front door and take 3 breaths before we head out in the morning. So put your lunchbox down, put your backpacks down. Let's just stop, 3 breaths, and now let's go. Instead of saying, let's have a mindful moment. And I think that kind of gets us pretty close to the end of the time. So
yeah, I would just tie all that together, because I think what you're saying sort of ties together with a lot of what Chris said, and some of what I touched on too, is a lot of it is just integrating it into everyday life. So if you want young kids to practice, it could be doing some of the activities Chris or Susan mentioned, and without labeling it necessarily. You can make a gratitude practice part of a meal without calling it a mindfulness practice. I think adding, that sort of ritual and routine idea of just adding something short, like a few breaths or a body scan or a gratitude practice to bedtime. Again, it just becomes part of day-to-day life more and more that way. I don't think we have a hard cap for time, and I think I'd like to just address one last question that I saw come up that's a challenging one, but I think is worth touching on for parents. Is somebody brought up the question of what if they're aiming to practice self-compassion, but it just, the negativity just seems all-consuming. And so maybe it's such a common experience as a parent, it's worth just taking that as the last question. I guess I would open the discussion by just saying that one of the things I find amazing about a lot of mindfulness practices and teachings is that they've been around for centuries, and yet they still apply. And one of the, consistently taught teachings for as long as, I've read about, has to do with this sense of something often called the inner critic or self-doubt. And just how it's a very common place our mind goes. It's a very common mental habit. The way I often look at it is it's one that becomes very ingrained, that we're often trying to be very logical and overcome through sheer will of effort and, convincing ourselves it's no longer true, when in the end, like Susan alluded to earlier, it's kind of a mental habit. We can sort of ask ourselves that question of, it seems real, but is it true? And that starts to create some distance from it, because we can begin to recognize, like, oh, that's a place I go when I'm triggered, but maybe, it's a thought. And we can start working with it that way. And it's really useful because it's certainly a common part of parenting. One of the reasons I think it's interesting that it's such a long-standing teaching is it connects us to that concept of common humanity, of like, wow, parenting is hard. This moment in time is hard. And the fact that I'm feeling triggered and uncertain and think I'm screwing up, that's common. We're all experiencing that as parents. So the practice is one of trying to kind of remind ourselves that we can approach those moments differently, to me. So I don't know if that begins to address the question that came up, or if Chris or Susan want to, round out my answer a little bit.
I think for me, just a couple ideas. One is trying to identify what this inner critic, is it an echo of our own parents? Is it an echo of other parents on the playground? Is it an echo of, the larger culture saying there's something wrong with you because, of the language you speak or the color of your skin, right? What is that internalized critical voice? And that can help us create some critical distance from it. The other is that one thing that's really important in therapy as a therapist, and that I have kind of applied to self-compassion, which is sort of being our own therapist or being our own parent in a lot of ways, is that the words that we use have to be really authentic, and the tone that we use has to be really authentic. I remember a client coming to me once and being like, I went to all these other therapists and they were all like Mr. Rogers, and I like how you just kind of talk like you. And I didn't really think about it, but it made me kind of realize that when we talk to ourselves, we can't bullshit ourselves by saying everything is great, I'm beautiful. That actually backfires, because we know that we're lying to ourselves. So speaking the truth to ourselves as we believe it, or may I be kind to myself, rather than I am kind to myself, or may I learn to see myself as good enough rather than I am good enough. Changing that language is really important, because we can't lie to ourselves. The other thing is to find that tone in the words that feel authentic. I tell a story sometimes about this little kind of mindful, self-compassion break, and you can sort of have these three parts of this is a moment of suffering, and everyone has a hard time, and may I be kind to myself. And a client who changed the language to make sense for them, like, this is an absolute shit show of a clusterfuck of the situation I'm in. And like, that's the naming it, because that's her language, right? And, everyone is going through this bullshit right now, right? And that's language that resonates for her. right? And so, putting it into your words, putting it into your tone, I think is also really important so that it feels authentic and not like you're giving yourself some platitudes in some ways, because those are going to ring false and they're not going to land.
Thank you, Chris. And Susan, do you want to add to that or just wrap up the hour? Either one? Oops, we can't hear you right now.
I have tree cutting in the neighbor's yard, so I put on the mute to try to keep the power saws less loud for us. I would like to kind of wrap in one of the last questions that we have here in the chat box from Mackenzie, who brown trousers time also agreed with. As an anxious mom, do we try to hide it? I'm afraid I will confuse my kids because they will see through faking it. And this goes a bit with what Chris was saying earlier about needing to be a little bit cautious about talking to kids about your own anxiety and making a distinction between that and being real. So much of this mindfulness work really is just about awareness. So if you're feeling anxious, if the first step is just awareness, I feel anxious right now, that in and of itself will often begin the process of a shift and help you start to relax a little bit more and to see it a little bit more. But I don't think, as far as talking to our kids, again, we need to be diagnosing ourselves or anybody else by calling these things specific terms. However, it's totally cool to say, mommy's feeling a little bit tired right now, or mommy's feeling a little worked up right now, or mommy's, if I had a glitter ball here, I would show you, mommy's mind feels a little bit like this, and you kind of shake up the glitter ball and see all the glitter shining. Yeah, that's kind of how mommy feels right now. Can you just hang with me for a second? And here comes, I was hoping Chris had a glitter ball. I saw him looking, where's my glitter ball? Or my snow globe. Can you just can you just hang with me for a bit and let's sit together and just breathe and feel our breathing and watch the snow settle? And so those kind of things where you do name it that mom's feeling a little bit off sorts, but we don't diagnose it. And then it's also a great opportunity to model. And this is what mom's going to do when I feel off sorts. You know what? I'm feeling a little out of sorts. I'm just going to do some mindful walking, or if you don't want to use my word mindfulness, I'm just going to do some, slow and silent walking. Want to join me? Let's just slowly and silently walk from the sink to the front door and back again. And that way you are using your own familiarity with mindfulness to regulate yourself, and you're modeling and you're naming it. Mom's feeling a little bit worked up right now, or mom's got a lot of speedy energy right now, and you're naming it, and then you are doing the practice with the child. So you're showing them what to do if they have speedy energy. So that would be my general thought. And Chris, since you raised it really early on, I'm wondering if you have something to add.
Yeah, I did actually really want to clarify that point, because we do lose it in front of our kids, and I'm not trying to say be perfect. One of the things we want to intend to do, aspire to do when we do lose it, is make sure our kids know that we're going to be okay. What's unsettling is to see their parents upset. But when we're able to say, like, yeah, I'm having a really hard time and I'm going to be okay. I need a little time. I'll feel better in 5 minutes. I'll feel better in an hour. That's so reassuring for kids. And it's a wonderful way of modeling for our kids how to name our emotions, how to show that emotions come, but they also go. And that we're comfortable with both sharing our emotions and tolerating our emotions. So modeling the whole cycle. So what's important is not to model just anxiety, but to try to model anxiety, the solution, or that we know that it will fade and we'll all be okay. I think that's the missing piece that I don't think I had gotten into there when I said that piece at the beginning. So thank you for bringing that back up, because that's a really important thing to note.
That's beautiful. That's really
beautiful.
Chris.
So anything either of you want to add before we wrap up for today? Any other questions you want to touch on, or anything else?
Just thank you, everybody. I know everybody's kind of zoomed out, and I appreciate your taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, everyone who took the time to be here. It was great, obviously, to see both of you, and you can find all three of us, for follow-up online pretty easily. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Susan, and hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime soon.
Hugs. Bye.